we're going to roll over to fruits and veggies. Natalie, you want to kick us off?
All right. Yes, let's kick it off. So we're going to talk really about some spring questions as well as, perennial and annual crops. I feel like the crazy winter that we've had a lot of ornamental questions, and we're probably just to the point when this is the week, right, that everybody goes out and plants their tomatoes, and then something happens. So there are good things to say about tomatoes. I think that we're actually going to start with fruits, and then we'll move on to vegetables. So Seth, I'm going to throw you a question about container blueberries. What type of blueberries? What type of containers? Any comments about media? And we do actually have a few images on that. Celeste.
Yeah. So as she's pulling up those pictures, that's a question that we get a lot of the times. And although blueberries in our residential settings really prefer to have that nice, well-drained, well-prepared, acidic soils, if you pick the right cultivar, you can certainly grow that in containers. So here you can see a few pictures here of what those containers might look like. Just note that the size is very important because these fibrous roots of these blueberries really need to work in this area with at least 24 inches of depth and at least 24 inches of width here. So definitely be mindful as to the size of that container. And just note that, that first year of planting, we're not going to be expecting the fruit to be developing here on that first year. We need to remove those blooms and allow those roots to work into this container. So back to that original question, yes, absolutely, you can certainly grow blueberries in containers if we select a high bush cultivar. So there's a few northern high bush cultivars that you could consider here, and even just container dwarf cultivars that have been bred for containers specifically. Some northern high bush varieties that maybe to consider would be like Duke, Blue Crop, maybe even Chandler. There's a few there. We have a publication on other varieties to choose from. And so even small scale container varieties like Berry Bucks or Jelly Bean even could be ones that we utilize. So pretty cool names there.
Jelly Bean. I love Jelly Bean.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. That's one of the
bean.
higher chill ones. There are some of those container, and so I'll admit this is one of those maybe don't do exactly what I do. This is peach sorbet, which if you look it up would actually be on the low side of our chilling hours, but I just move it back and forth a lot. My garage is right there, so yeah.
And that's one thing I wanted to notice too. Yes, we can talk about chilling hours here in a second for these different cultivars, but when we have these containers, the one benefit of using containers is that during those winter months, we're having that really cold temperatures, really high winds coming through. We can actually protect and shelter these blueberries, maybe on a towards a wall to protect that wind from hitting them from winter winds, and maybe even save some of their hardiness there. So that is one consideration to think about these. Also on those containers, one of the questions asked was what type of media or soilless media that we should be utilizing. We're recommending a 50-50 mix of that potting soil and peat moss. Peat moss is really important for these blueberries to establish with their root system. So consider that, and also well drained. If that container doesn't have drain plugs in the bottom of it, let's not use them, right? So even when we're putting them on a flat surface, that heat from maybe a concrete surface could heat up and dry out that container. So always be mindful as to that separation of between the ground and maybe even just using a pallet or bricks just to keep that off of the ground there and prevent drying out. But yep, those blueberries are very susceptible to drying out quickly. So be mindful of keeping that soil wet. And hopefully I made all the notes on that question as best I could, but did I miss anything, Natalie or Greg?
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned about timing on those. I should say those are 3-year-old blueberries. So those are actually COVID plants that are still alive right now. It's so exciting. And so this, this is really the first year that I'm letting them fruit. And those were actually rabbit eyes in those larger containers. And so they bloomed early, but I moved them back and forth into the garage as well. So that's why there's actually some fruit on them. And after, as you can imagine, 2 or 3 years, that media had broken down. And so this year I actually just pulled the plant out, put in some new media, and that has a lot of composted pine bark in it, so you can see those large particle sizes for good drainage.
And
And that's a
Natalie, had
question we
that,
might get, is like when to replant too. I know generally speaking, we want to kind of do that early fall period so that those roots can have time to develop into that dormant period. So sorry to cut you off, Lee. Go ahead.
no, I was just curious about any girdling roots or root encircling roots. Did you, when you pulled that out, did you see a lot of those, Natalie?
Not really. Most of the, especially if we're thinking about a high bush, a lot of our roots are in the upper portion. And actually, of course, those were actually bare root plants. They weren't container plants, so they, didn't have a lot of potentially challenging root issues when they went in.
Yeah, understood. Okay, thank you.
But Lee made a great point about those girdling roots. And if we're purchasing these plants and we've said, oh, Seth thought these high bush cultivars are going to do well, and we take it out of its container and you see those roots circling themselves, it's really important to tease those together or tease those apart just to encourage that root expansion into that new potting media. So always be mindful of that whenever we're thinking about planting into containers.
Natalie, I don't mean to go back, but a minute ago on your potted blueberry bushes, something that I thought was an observation a lot of people ought to make with blueberries or any of their fruits was the leaf color on those plants and addressing the pH and when those plants may be yellow or they may be red.
I was literally thinking about that when we showed that picture. I'm like, I'm gonna have to say, Greg, I don't think this is nutritional. That peach sorbet actually has a little bit of a reddish color. But yes, to your point, when you have a really well-drained media like that, it is easy to to get low on nutrition. And so I actually have done a little bit of a feeding so far, but those haven't gotten a lot yet this spring. And actually on some of those rabbit eyes, I'm starting to see a little bit of lighter color. I think I need to get in there and do a little fertilization.
That would be the big things with blueberries. When you start seeing that lime green color, that you've got the iron deficiency in those, it all is a product of pH getting too high. And so probably the yellowing color would concern me more than some of the reddish hues that we would see in those.
Right. And we'll see that just like you would, on a tree where you have a high pH issue, like some of our oaks, you'll see the green veins and then the yellow leaf tissue. And that's going to be one of your biggest clues. Fruit topic that actually popped into the question and answer while we were talking this morning. And it is from someone who has a fig tree that has, or shrub bush, that has struggled since the winter time period. And they're actually seeing evidence of ambrosia beetles. And this is really interesting because actually on Tuesday morning, Lockwood spoke for our intern training class, and we were actually talking about this in the hallway. He had seen ambrosia beetles in one of his neighbor's figs. So they actually see those little kind of tiny sticks almost of frass. And so we're talking about a beetle that will be attracted to weak or damaged types of tissue, which we're seeing from, kind of a borderline plant like a fig. So it's very possible that upper portion of the plant may be dead or very, on its way out. So it may be a good year to go to, fig shrubs instead of fig trees, which sometimes happens to us in East Tennessee, especially. We'll have one of those just kill off the top portion of the plant. So that might be an opportunity to just really clean that up well. There are some spray options, and I'm going to put a cool link in the chat box so that folks can look at that. It is actually an article from a couple or 9 years ago from some of our neighbors down at University of Georgia who saw this exact phenomenon following a cold snap. And so there's a good picture in there, and sanitation is probably where I would start first, because it can be hard to control by insecticides. Does anybody else want to throw anything else about figs while we're on that topic?
Well, I'd just say, even along the same lines, that ambrosia beetle can affect lots of trees in a landscape. And typically when you see the signs that the ambrosia beetle's done its deed, that the top of that tree is generally gone. And so that's a response. So, basically those trees, when they're under stress, they'll emit an alcohol odor that draws those beetles in. And so that tree was under stress, and that was basically attracted in for those. If you're going to grow figs in the state of Tennessee, you need to plant. They will grow. We can even successfully grow them here on the plateau, but you better have some plans in place for winter type protection, because they can be killed back to the ground if they're not protected, or site selection's a little bit off.
And the only thing I would mention is cultivar selection. And I can't find that pub, but Natalie, I know we had a pub. I think it's like Brown Turkey, Chicago Hardy,
Celeste.
Celeste. Come on, you know some.
Well, I didn't want to brag, but
You have to remember the Celeste variety.
All
I
right.
think,
So
I think it might be a good transition from nutritional discoloration to maybe what we've gotten from a apple and pear tree question.
oh yes.
Where they said that they had some fruit that seemed to have some fungal growth on it. And you can see in the picture, if we can get that pulled up later on too, that maybe there was some, yeah, there we go, perfect. Maybe some fungal growth there as well. And I wanted to see if maybe Melody or Greg wanted to try to tackle this question here.
Oh, yeah, this is one of my favorites. This is one we don't see this time of year. It's usually something we see late summer, early fall, because that's typically when the infection sets in. But what's really unique about this is that it does affect our apple and pear trees, but then it also can affect other landscape trees. So kind of be cognizant of that, like willows and sycamore, sumac, some of those type trees as well. But what this is called, it's actually two different organisms, sooty mold and fly speck, and it's caused by two different fungal organisms, but oftentimes you'll hear us just lump those together, because typically when you see one, you see the other. We can't really, I don't guess, blow this picture up, but the sooty mold is more of that dark color, more of a, I guess it's just kind of a muted color, the black soot looking on the fruit. The fly speck is going to be just that. It's like little specks of glitter, like little tiny pinpricks on that fruit. As far as control, one of the best things you can do is, pruning the tree, obviously, in January, February, March is a good cultural practice, because that's going to get airflow through those canopy, because a fungal organism is spores that kind of float through the air, and they're also carried by water. So oftentimes when we get into like a late period of wet weather that's extended in late summer, that's when we see this infection really be, more pronounced. As far as fungicides, Captan is your friend on that. Now is typically not the time to be applying that. Because again, it's going to be later in the season when we see that really start occurring, although Mother Nature has thrown us a few curveballs in the last couple of years, and we'll see it a little bit earlier than usual. But the good news is that this is cosmetic. You can still eat the skins of that fruit. We have commercial folks that will actually rub that off that fruit, so it will come off very easily. It's not going to affect the integrity of that fruit at all. So keep that in mind. It just kind of looks ugly, not very aesthetically pleasing. Another thing, those spores overwinter. So go through each fall, clean out your orchard when you're pruning, make sure, good sanitation, good pruning, even thinning of that fruit is going to be essential to make sure we're not just keeping those spores reproducing. And that's going to be one of the best ways you can get this under control.
Melody said, right now is really not the time spray wise for that, but you should already be well underway in terms of your spray programs. So most of those fungal diseases that really have a tremendous impact on our fruit crops happen prior to the bloom. And so most of you have probably already gone past the bloom, or here on the plateau, we're actually apple wise right in the peak of apple bloom. And once we get past that, we'll have a couple of those initial sprays that are really important. And then it just becomes regular cover sprays. As she mentioned, both of those are cosmetic. If you're selling apples at the farmer's market, people look at them, may not be interested in those apples because they don't have that pristine, pretty shine to them. but actually that does nothing to the flavor or the fruitfulness of it. It's just a cosmetic, as Melody would say. So,
And one more thing on that, you hear us always talk about cultivars, plant those resistant cultivars. We don't really know of a resistant cultivar to these two fungal phenomena. So just kind of keep that in mind. Don't wear yourself out trying to find those. It's something that's going to affect a lot of our landscape and fruit trees. It also affects blackberry, just FYI. So if you have that in your landscape, you're probably going to be more prone to see this occur.
But I'm glad you mentioned pruning too, Melody, because sunlight penetration and airflow can always help greatly to reduce disease.
Absolutely.
As Lockwood says, sunlight is one of our best fungicides, right?
There you go. Yep.
Yes.
And y'all, there's other diseases that could pop up on apples and pears if we don't do that. I know we said these were mostly cosmetic, but we've got apple scab to worry about, fire blight, cedar apple rust. And I'm going to drop in this link, disease and insect control in home fruit plantings manual. So if you're wondering what that Captan product was and when to apply it, it'll help walk you through that too.
PB 1622. We couldn't get through a spring discussion without it, right?
And I dropped in the publication of selecting apples and pears for Tennessee, so you can look at that as well.
Y'all are on top of it. I'm loving this. Excellent.
Yeah, I will say, if you haven't seen that apple and pear pub, it's actually fairly new, and it's a stoplight system. So they're color coded according to their disease resistant palette. And what you might find is that some of the things that you like to buy the most in the grocery store, honey Chris, may actually be on the very challenging for Tennessee list. So think about some of the opportunities that we have for some of those newer, more disease resistant cultivars. Before we completely
We've got like 5 minutes if we want to do any veggie stuff.
Right. Yeah. So I think that we should talk about vegetables. And we had a really good question that came in that was talking about growing media. And so a lot of our very, dedicated and skilled gardeners will often grow their own transplants. And so there's a whole host of media that is out there. And I mean, I think that one of the most important things, just kind of to begin with, is that there is in real life, a big difference between your germination media and kind of your grow out media. So I'm not promoting any, specific type of, brands, but that germination mix is going to have finer particles in it, right? Because it is going to have a slower drainage, it's going to have a high water holding capacity, and it is made for small cells, right? So, and I say this because I've done it myself, right? You got a little bit of germination mix left over, and when you get ready to transplant, you're like, how big a difference could it make? A lot, actually a lot, right? Because when you go up to your, your cell pack or your kind of grow out mix, you're going to have larger particles. So even less fine peat, you're going to have more perlite, you may have more vermiculite. And so that germination mix is going to have, somewhere between about, 10 and 15% airspace, whereas, your grow out mix is going to be more in that 15 to 20%. And that may not seem like a lot, but it makes a big difference in the grow out phase. And so the specific question that we got was from somebody that has been mixing their own media a lot. And over the past few years, we have been having, I know this is a big surprise, supply chain challenges, right? So it's been harder to find some of these different types of media that you may be used to working with. So you may be used to a coarse vermiculite, and what you've been finding is a much finer product. And so what I would say is use a little bit more perlite when you make that mix, right? So if you can't find exactly the vermiculite that you want, then move up and use a perlite, which is kind of the, popcorny looking, also a superheated rock material. So, kind of adjust the rest of your mix. And a lot of times we'll be at approximately a third by volume of those different types of materials. The other thing that might even be easier to find in our area is if you're having trouble with really fine peat or really fine vermiculite, add in some composted pine bark, a little bit of a more nursery mix. Now, I have also grown my tomato transplants in a nursery mix. And, as long as you would like to water them every 15 minutes, it's a great system. So don't grow them solely in a nursery mix. But if you need to increase the particle size, you could add a little bit there. Is there anything else you want to throw in about that, Greg? Was that detailed enough?
No, I think that's good.
Yeah.
Real
Yeah.
good. And again, maybe touch on the nutritional side of that. So the more porous it gets, the more that you're watering, the more it's going to wash nutrients out, the more pH can change. So don't love them to death, and use some balance in everything that you do.
Yeah, the nutritional side is a really important point. Like, you can buy peat moss, you can buy core, you can buy all of those elements individually, but if you buy a mix, it has been pH balanced a little bit, and so that helps you out with not having to worry as much about some of the pH. I think the biggest questions that we probably get right now are about planting and timing. So I would always end any discussion about spring vegetables as, remember, if you put your cucumbers in the ground when it's 60 degrees, it'll take them 12 days to germinate. But if you put them in the ground when it's 75 degrees, it'll only take them 5 days to germinate, and they probably won't rot. So just because the air temperature is high enough that we get excited does not mean that the soil temperature is high enough to really speed germination. So Melody, Greg, Steph, anything you want to? Yeah.
But you could go ahead and start getting your ground ready. You could start getting those. You can start doing things for sure.
Get those cover crops turned over or under, y'all.
I could really tell when I was driving, around the county this past week, everybody was getting their gardens prepared. Well, who have, conventional gardens. If you were needing to till or get your plastic laid, it's like, everyone heard the bell ringing and it was time to go for it.
The other thing, Natalie, people get really in a hurry to get those seeds started early as well. And a lot of times they can plant those seeds so early that those plants will actually grow beyond where we want them to be as a transplant. So just be patient, take your time, plan those things out. Don't be in too big of a hurry to get to the garden.
Yeah. My transplants are about this big right now. Every year I transplant them later seed for transplant later, because we get a lot of sunlight. They just grow so fast in April. They're huge by the early part of May.
Mm-hmm.
And just remember, we're harping on this, but way up here in Northeast Tennessee, we're going to be a little bit behind. So just because it's nice out there, that soil temp, especially, for beans, peppers, tomatoes, they're just going to go, what? So,
and let's also give a super quick reminder shout out about our average frost dates, right? So even if you have started things inside and you feel like you can go ahead and get a few things put out because you're willing to cover them up, the 15th is like the average frost date over here in Jackson. So that's our 50% frost date. So while we kind of designate that as our frost-free date, well, you really got a 50% chance that you might get a frost after then. So you really need to be prepared. Can we give quick shout outs for what the dates are across the state?
Yeah, and if you guys are wondering about these dates too, that last link that Taylor had put in there, the Tennessee Vegetable Garden Planning, it has it located from Bristol to Jackson to Knoxville to Memphis. And I'll say here in the Knoxville area, it's going to be that 90% certainty that we won't have a day below 32 degrees, hopefully after April 28th. So that's our date here for Knoxville area.
Our date is, we say May the 10th, but we got our last frost last year, May the 11th.
Oh my.
That was 91% chance right there.
We've had 2 consecutive years of 1 in 10 years. So, it's been crazy the last few years. But I also put in the link to the home fruit and vegetable garden calendar, which has those dates kind of by region throughout the month. So feel free to jump in there.